the European Radio and Digital Audio Show.
My name is Dave Taylor. That's onward? Brilliant, thank you. So when I was working on this talk, I realized it seemed to be a bit odd to be focusing on the visuals of this PowerPoint slide deck for an event that focused exclusively on radio and audio. And since I'm here to talk about audio and spoken word in particular, and also because I grew up as a child of radio, and I'm just a little bit, okay. I love the spoken word, so I thought I'd take the opportunity to do it the old way. So you'll have to imagine your cup of hot chocolate sitting outside the window listening to the radio. A little introduction. I'm a comms strategy consultant and an advisor, but mostly that's just a way to pay the bills while I pursue my love of the language. And as I mentioned before, this is more philosophy than statistics. I'm about the language and the words and the love of the communication. Matty wrote a very comprehensive blog post on the statistics of the European podcast ecosystem. I'll put the link up at the end of the presentation. It's got charts, it's got the stats, it's got a very good quantified overview. But I'm not going to be going into that in great detail because it's just the numbers, and this is more about the spirit. Most of what I do for Podigy is to remind Matty and the team that there's this world of content outside of the little Podigy lens, that outside of podcasting there's a lot of different forms of content and a lot of movement and a lot of dynamism and especially a lot of money that's sloshing around. And people like myself, we need to find new and exciting channels to communicate our messages to our audiences. And we try to work together to find a way to bring Podigy forward into being a good form of messaging that goes outside of a self-limiting community. So I try my best to help him build a better delivery vehicle for the words that I love, and he tells me that while it's a nice idea, it's pretty much impossible. And he gives excuses like technology doesn't do that, or give me Google money and I might be able to work something out, or my personal favorite of, you understand that this is podcasting, not Star Trek. But despite that, we work on it, and we've actually been able to come up with some interesting notions that might actually make it in the real world, and especially with help from the community, such as yourselves. So keeping that in mind, podcasting in Europe is an interesting topic because it's an interesting place. There's an awful lot of history, and we need to work with it, and we need to work around it. And just as it seems like we're getting some form of European consensus, some form of overview, someone throws a bit of a fit and throws their toys out of the pram, like Brexit. But Brexit aside, let's look at the basic numbers. 44 countries, 39 of which are larger than city-states. 24 official languages in the EU, and that's just the tip of the iceberg for linguistic diversity. And one of the great benefits for podcasting is that as a grassroots medium of communication, it really embraces linguistic diversity. There's no market-based cap on language, and it's an extremely good vehicle for preserving smaller endangered languages. And as a Canadian, this is something very important to me because we have a lot of native languages that are getting lost because the voices are not being heard, and podcasting is a vehicle by which these voices can be heard. It's a wealth of cultures and languages, and the podcast ecosystem is here. It's good, as Declan mentioned. It's varied in its level of sophistication. Here in France, Germany, the UK, and Scandinavia are about the most sophisticated, and it drops off quite strongly after that. But even though there's a lot of diversity of culture and language and nationality, it creates a fragmentation, and it means that nothing that we do here in Europe comes even close to the level of sophistication as being achieved in the US. And that is the key. That's the elephant in the room, is the US. What do we do with it? All those Americans and their ridiculous amounts of investment money that everything we do, anything we do, ends up becoming a comparison with the US. We just saw it. Bring US content into the European market, which is a great thing to do, but that's not European, is it? They're just omnipresent in media and in tech, and that's a reality we have to live with. So, quick overview. Europe, Western Europe versus the US, same landmass, more or less, twice as many people here. Europe leads on political, cultural, linguistic diversity. We have much, much better cheese, but we lag behind on technology, on media, and on podcasting. So why? I mean, simply put, they have a lot more resources at their disposal, and they're able to concentrate them on a much, much smaller marketplace. It's not monolingual, but it's effectively monolingual. It's a smaller community. They have a much bigger hammer, and they can use it on a lot fewer nails. So they're able to bring a lot more power to the point. They're also helped by the fact that they have a large body of venture capital floating around. They have much, much looser data control regulations, and they have a laissez-faire monopoly, laissez-faire attitude towards tech monopolies. So, a good position for them. But, flip side, they have a media consumption ecosystem dominated by corporate interests. It's actively fragmenting into walled gardens, both by rights managements and also by the platform ecosystem and the on-demand subscription model. They have unrestricted harvesting of personal data, and they have scraping of content that they're putting out for free without consent. It's very much a "'tis better to ask forgiveness than permission" kind of environment. So where does that leave us? If we're asking, will Europe be able to bring itself to the level of US podcasting, I think the answer is actually no. We don't have the kind of money, and the money we have is spread across too many demographics. We can't be that big. But if we're asking how are we positioned in the future of podcasting, the answer is a lot better. Because while the diversity and stricter regulation in this space is a weakness if you're trying to pursue a model of venture capital funded, ad-driven and data mining driven media distribution, it's a strength when looking at potential to leapfrog over into something new and different and better. And that's the new status quo that I believe we need to move towards. We'll have to see how it emerges. Whatever we come up with will have to have better metadata. I think discovery is an enormous issue. It'll have to have much better targeting. And this increasing merging of radio and podcasts will bring us to something which is not quite one, not quite the other, but is something actually new and different. And looking for that kind of a technological leapfrog isn't unheard of. There's examples all over. When a market leader entrenches heavily in a form of technology, it becomes very difficult for them to pivot into the next generation. Whereas a less committed, less mature ecosystem is able to grow into something new. They're able to say, okay, I'm going to go to the next level. And a good example of this is if you look at the adoption of mobile media in China. China went from basic internet to the world leader in mobile internet effectively overnight. In the space of 10 years, they went from, if you want to send an email, you go to an internet cafe and you give them your passport, to absolutely everything being available on WeChat. You can search, you can discuss, you can purchase, you can do anything completely off your mobile. And people don't use desktops except for work. They bypassed the whole issue of let's go from broadband and DSL and up to fiber. They just said, okay, we're going to the next generation, and we will never catch up. Another and perhaps better example for a podcasting audience is South Korea. 58% podcast penetration. Because South Korean media, first of all, it's almost universal smartphone adoption, and South Korean media went to digital delivery very early. Their media ecosystem exists somewhere between podcast and broadcast. It is something new. And while Korea is more monolingual and more monocultural than the States, it's an incredibly exciting proof of concept that a country can change its entire concept of how media is created and delivered to a new paradigm of how we receive it. Everybody gets it on their phones. So what are we going to do with it? Where's our future? Hard to say. So what would a new European podcast, or whatever we want to call it, ecosystem look like to be fundamentally European? First of all, it won't be, or it can't be, a monopoly. It won't even be close. I don't think it would be legal. I certainly don't believe that the governments of France or Germany would permit that sort of monopoly. It'll be culturally diverse, it'll be multilingual, and it will be consent-driven. It won't be monetized by the sale of personal information, thanks to the GDPR, and it will almost definitely have a level of government involvement or government regulation in it, and I think we're okay with that. I think that if we take a look across the pond and we see what's happened with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and the violation of personal data protection, that having a government pull the reins back is not a bad thing. And that said, the challenge that's posed by the diversity of the European marketplace can be offset because we reduce or eliminate the kind of platform and content rights monopolies which are beginning to dominate the American market. Without the idea of being able to have a monopoly which holds all the rights, then suddenly you have a much freer, more diverse, more open ecosystem, and it becomes a much more promising place. If you want to look down the crystal ball into the future, look what happened with Netflix. That Netflix went from being the on-demand streaming service, and now every one of the major production houses is opening its own streaming service, and the consumer is being obliged to get a full range of content to subscribe to this, to subscribe to the other, to keep paying. It's putting the screws to them because it's a monopoly. So a future truly European podcast ecosystem will, by necessity, have better, more internationalized metadata, because we need to be able to find things across languages. We need to be able to discover things through a relatively standardized format. And it will have an ethos that recognizes that while listeners need the programming, we've moved beyond the phase of what's on the radio. We've also moved beyond the phase of I'm going to seek out and download this. That we want a automated delivery, we want on-demand delivery, we want to be able to have a system that knows what we like and delivers us content that we both specifically want and content that it thinks we will like. More complicated if the metadata isn't sorted out. And we'll end up with something a little bit more along the Korean line. There'll be a bit more news, a bit more topicality, and a blurring of the traditional and the new. The broadcast and the podcast will cease to be. The terms may be used, but they'll be effectively obsolete. It will be something in between. It will be something new. And the fact that we're headed to this almost exclusively on-demand model of content consumption seems pretty inevitable. I mean, video has proven that, both through standard programming via Netflix and the other on-demand systems, and also YouTube. But the number of technical and legal obstacles in audio to having a truly open on-demand ecosystem are actually quite high, with the involvement of rights management. How do you work with platform-based walled gardens? Can you build a model where, as in music, you pay your subscription to the PRO and you have the right to play the music, instead of an actual one platform having bought the rights to a single content producer's stream forever and away? So it's going to make for a model of content consumption that is evolved into more of listener-driven, fair, free, and open ecosystem. So this isn't just a function of the trend to platforms and subscription-driven walled gardens. The creator rights management is going to be a very significant issue in the future. People who create the content deserve to get paid. And exploiting loopholes to get around the rights to pay, to build individual contracting systems, as has been done with the music industry, is very good for venture capital. You can raise a lot of money that way. But it isn't terribly good for a sustainable business model, and it's definitely not good for maintaining a strong creative ecosystem. It won't work here. We don't have a regulatory environment that permits things like scraping content and putting it out on a paid platform, like Luminary did. We also don't have the ecosystem that really approves of sort of badgering creators into placing their content for exposure, like Spotify does. It's like you can put your content up, people will listen to you, but you can't monetize it. So here, we can take advantage of the less entrenchment, we can bypass everything and create something better. I think the community here is fueled more by love than a craving for big investment. Just looking out there at the smaller producers and people here, they love what they're doing. They interact with their competition. There's no real hard feelings. It is a community that is not daggers out looking for the money. And I know for a fact there's a lot of bright lights working towards the next iteration. So, the ultimate question about building a truly European ecosystem is, can we work together enough to build it, or will we end up with multiple standards, multiple competing small players, and get steamrollered by the power of the almighty dollar? I don't know the answer for that, but I can tell you that I don't think anyone here wants to wake up in the morning and find out all their content has been controlled by Disney, Google, Apple Book Company, and that if you want something independent, you have to go onto the darknet and get it through some form of like back channel samizdat. So I have a challenge out of this. As Europeans and as concerned members of the community, find some consensus, build a better mousetrap, work with each other, work with business, work with government and regulators, create a better future for the ecosystem. And most importantly, don't waste your genius chasing the American status quo. Push the horizon beyond it and build something more fair and for a more equal future. Thank you.
The European Radio and Digital Audio Show.